GBH and WCAI, where she heads up Living Lab Radio, a multi-format exploration of the intersection of science with other facets of society, including economics, politics, education, and art. I could go on and read a whole bunch of stuff, but you get the picture. Heather is a rock star in the environmental business. It's my pleasure to introduce Heather Goldstone.
First of all, I'm honored to be here, and thank you. It's a beautiful spot, and I've already had really wonderful conversations with many of you. When Steve first invited me, he said, you know, I know you don't necessarily do river stuff a lot, just make sure there's something about water in there somewhere. So I figured that wouldn't be too hard. I tend to do more ocean stuff than river stuff, but of course, rivers flow to the sea, so it's all connected. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the local impacts of climate change and what's happening on everything from the local to the international level to try to address the issue of climate change. And before we get to that, I just want to start with the absolute basics. Make sure we're all starting from the same page, and that's the nature of the greenhouse effect. Because this is something that we've known about for about 200 years. That's how old the science of the greenhouse effect is. And it's something that's happening all the time. In fact, it's the only reason that life on Earth is possible. So light from the sun comes down through the atmosphere, hits the surface of the Earth, is absorbed, and some of that is re-radiated back into the atmosphere as heat. And greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane and others, we need some of those because we need to trap that heat in order to make the planet livable. But as we pump more and more and more of those gases into the atmosphere, it's kind of like putting a blanket over the planet, and less of that heat is able to escape through the atmosphere. It bounces back and forth, and the result, if I can get this to work, whoops, is it going to do it? There we go. Is that over the past 130 or so years, this is just a heat map of the planet, average annual temperatures, and of course, warmer colors mean warmer temperatures, and you can see the whole globe, not uniformly, but across the globe, we're seeing more and more and more yellow, and then red, and it's getting redder and redder and redder. And this doesn't actually even go up to the past few years. We have now had 2 years in a row of record-breaking temperatures, which is in and of itself a record to have 2 years back to back each be the hottest year on record. And at this point, it's only March, but we are well on our way to having the 3rd year in a row that is not only the hottest year on record, but the hottest by a record-setting margin. And this doesn't just affect the atmosphere. What you're seeing here are surface air temperatures, but in fact, 90+% of the heat that's trapped by greenhouse gases actually ends up in the ocean. And as I said, this doesn't happen uniformly around the globe. What we've learned in the past few years is that in fact, the Northeast, New England, is really a hotspot for global warming. So this map is actually showing ocean temperatures, and what you're looking for are red spots, and you can see that little box and that really, really, really red area. That's from about the Chesapeake Bay up to Canada along the East Coast, warming faster than 99% of the rest of the ocean. One of the fastest warming parts of the ocean in the entire world is right off of our coastlines. Now that has a lot of different implications. For one, Greenland, to our north, is home to a lot of land-based ice, and increasingly what we've learned in the past several years is that warming of the air and melting of glaciers from the top down is what initially had most of scientists and policymakers' attention, and that's important. But as these land-based glaciers flow out over the ocean, they create floating ice shelves and warm water. And when I say warm, it doesn't actually have to be very warm. It only has to be above freezing to start melting ice. As the water there gets warmer and warmer, it melts those glaciers from underneath and allows the whole land-based ice sheet to move and melt more quickly. We're seeing that happening in Greenland, and we're seeing that happening in Antarctica. That, of course, has major implications for sea level rise. And here again, the Northeast is a bit of a hot spot for sea level rise, not only because sea level around the globe is rising, but sea level doesn't rise evenly everywhere, which I know sounds really weird. We tend to think of the ocean as being this nice flat expanse, but there are hills and mountains and valleys in the surface of the ocean, just like there are on the surface of the land. And off of our coast here, part of the reason that it's warming so quickly also has to do with the oceanography off of our coast, and in particular the Gulf Stream. So if you took the Gulf Stream, we're used to thinking of looking at an aerial photo, looking down at, here's the land and here's the ocean and the Gulf Stream goes up. But if you take that and you rotate it and you actually look into kind of so that the Gulf Stream is flowing away from you, that's what you're looking at here, as if you were at the surface of the water, floating in the ocean at the surface of the water, and the Gulf Stream is headed away from you north, and the east coast of the United States is off to your left. What happens as the Gulf Stream moves north is that it pulls water with it, and it actually kind of pulls water away from our coast. Well, as the ocean gets warmer, that Gulf Stream is actually slowing down, and in fact, what's predicted is as much as a 30 to 50% slowdown, and we actually had one event in 2012 where temperatures were anomalously high, and there was a dramatic shift, a slowdown in the Gulf Stream, and about 5 extra inches of water piled up against the coast of New England. And so because of this predicted slowdown in the Gulf Stream, New England is also predicted, and has actually had over the past century, much higher than average sea level rise rates. And that's also a fact of our geology. We have all these things coming together in the Northeast. We are still, after the creation of Cape Cod and the islands at the end of the last glacial period, as that glacier retreated back up through New England and up into Canada, the land here rebounded. It got lighter and it bounced up. Well, as that glacier continued retreating up through Canada, it's like a seesaw, and Canada started to rebound and we started going back down again. And we're still doing that. So our land is sinking ever so slightly, sea level is rising globally, and then as the Gulf Stream slows down, we get more of that water piling up along our coast. The end result of all this is that New England is quite vulnerable to sea level rise. In fact, one estimate made by scientists at Climate Central last year looked if we continued on our current trends of greenhouse gas emissions, that something like 22 cities and towns along Massachusetts coastline would be threatened by sea level rise, with almost 250,000 people in those threatened areas. Buzzards Bay, Cambridge, my own hometown of Falmouth, Hull, Marshfield, Revere, Salisbury, West Yarmouth, Winthrop. So there are major residential areas along our coastlines that are very susceptible to sea level rise, and we see this every single year as storms come in, and we see those storm surges going higher and higher. Now, these rising ocean temperatures also have major implications not only for those of us who live on land, but for the things that live in the water, perhaps not surprisingly. So data collected by Buzzards Bay Coalition around the whole edge of Buzzards Bay over the past 20 years has shown, so the size of the red triangles here just shows you how much it has warmed. There are only 2 spots along the bay where they haven't seen a significant increase in average temperatures. So in general, temperatures are going up in the bay, and the background picture there is eelgrass, because an analysis they did within the past year, they found that a problem that is very familiar to all of us here in southeastern Massachusetts is nutrient pollution, algal blooms, and how that then kills eelgrass and creates fish kills. And they found that as temperatures rise, you see a significant amplification of the impact of nutrients. So they actually have a linear relationship. If you kept nitrogen at one level and raised the temperature, you would eventually see a doubling of the amount of algal growth due to that same level of nitrogen. And in fact, they've found, based on their analysis, that the total maximum daily loads, those TMDLs that have been calculated, are not quite, but they're still very important to have those there, but they're almost out of date at this point because of the amount of warming the relationship that went into determining those maximum loads was based on pre-warming scenarios. It also affects not only plant life and algal life, but we see the impacts of warming on many of our commercially fished species. So this is showing how lobster has moved as the temperatures rise. Many species move north and offshore. So if you look again, this is kind of like a heat map. Yellow and red means where there's lots of lobsters. The blue color where there's not as many. Starting in 1968, if we look at where you see lobster in the spring, and it's going to do this to me for every video, you can watch them over the span of just a handful of decades moving up, and we start to see this hot spot out in the Gulf of Maine, and then over here in Massachusetts Bay, and they keep moving right on up into the Gulf of Maine. You're seeing the coast of Maine lighting up more and more and more as time goes by. Lobsters are basically moving north, and at this point the lobster fishery south and west of Cape Cod, so Buzzards Bay, Narragansett Bay, and over toward Long Island, that fishery has been closed on and off for the past several years, and one of the major culprits is thought to be summer temperatures, because of several years ago, the Massachusetts State lobster biologists say it's like somebody flipped a switch, and suddenly the number of days during the summer that were above lobsters' comfort threshold basically hit a number where they couldn't make it. And so we're not seeing the lobster populations in those areas reproducing and thriving, but we are seeing lobsters booming in the Gulf of Maine at this point. Now, the folks at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center have done an analysis recently of our commercial fisheries' vulnerability to climate change in a number of different ways, and what they've found is that over half of our commercially fished species are at high to very high risk of this phenomenon of shifting. And in fact, we've known for almost a decade that over the past 50 years, over half of our commercially fished species have moved significantly, most of them northward and offshore. Some of them do interesting things because they don't care which depth they're at as much, and so they may go deeper. They may even come inshore and go deeper. But fish are moving around, and because they're not all moving in the same way, some of them are moving inshore while many are moving northward and offshore, you see ecosystems being disrupted because suddenly the food for one isn't where it used to be, or it isn't there at the same time. And this is actually, on a geological scale anyway, a pretty rapid shift on average. A number of different studies have shown that the shift at this point is averaging about 5 miles per decade that these species are marching northward. Now, you might say, okay, well, cod is moving north, and I actually saw an article several years ago about in Greenland, they're cheering the fact that cod is moving north, their cod fishery might come back. There are winners and losers, and yes, that does mean there are other things coming from Chesapeake Bay region that are headed our way. I had a conversation with some folks at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center a number of years ago, and I said, all right, what's coming to replace cod? And they said, yeah, well, they kind of hemmed and hawed. I said, come on, look, you gotta give me one thing. What's coming to replace cod? I mean, maybe we can replace lobsters with blue crabs, right? What's coming to replace cod? And they finally said, Atlantic croaker. And I said, you need a PR campaign. Because it may be great in the Gulf of Mexico where they've been eating croaker for ages, but nobody's suddenly gonna wanna go from cod for dinner to croaker. There are species coming in, but this is a problem. And it's not just the temperatures that are rising and these changes in where things are found, but we're also seeing a fundamental change in the chemistry of the ocean. So the ocean's not only absorbing the heat, the ocean actually absorbs about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere directly into the ocean. This is a graph showing in red, there we go, is atmospheric carbon dioxide as measured at an observatory atop Mauna Loa in Hawaii. This is actually the rise in carbon dioxide in the ocean nearby. And then the green at the bottom is the pH, the acidity of the ocean. And you can see that's changing, because what happens when the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide is a chemical reaction that actually creates carbonic acid. And makes the ocean more acidic. It also, as part of that, makes it much harder for animals that make calcium carbonate-based shells or skeletons to do that. So coral reefs have a much harder time building the actual reef. Oysters have a much harder time building their shells. And interestingly, it's not only the things that need to build a calcium skeleton that have a problem. Studies have shown that changes in ocean chemistry, this acidification of the ocean, can actually affect the sense of smell and neurological function in fish and other wildlife. Imagine, we're changing our air and we're changing the water that the fish and other animals breathe. But to give you a sense of how dramatic these changes in shells can be as a result of acidification, a study a few years ago at Stony Brook University, what they actually did is they had 3 different tanks that they grew. In this case, these are, I believe, bay scallops. They also did quahogs. And they had one tank where they actually sucked the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere there, and they replicated conditions, pre-industrial conditions, where we had about 250 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's what a 1-month-old baby scallop would look like under those conditions. They then took something that at the time was approximately what we have in the atmosphere. We're now at 400 parts per million, just a few years later. And you can already see, I took some care here to make sure that they were approximately the same size. If anything, this middle picture is a little bit magnified compared to the original, and yet you can see how much smaller that baby scallop is. And then if you look into the future, even tinier. And even just comparing pre-industrial to current day conditions, they found that by 1 month, on average, the baby scallops were half the size and they were twice as likely to die. So that's what we've done already, and this is continuing. And going back to that recent assessment of the vulnerability of our fisheries to climate change, if you put together the temperature changes and the changes in the chemistry as well as sea level rise and ecosystem shifts, if you put all this together and look at how vulnerable our commercially fished species are to just declining in numbers as a result of all these different insults, what we see is 22 species in the highest risk category, including Atlantic salmon, striped bass, quahogs, bay scallops. Sea scallops are actually one category down in terms of their risk, but an analysis last year by the National Resources Defense Council and others found that if you then add another layer to your vulnerability assessment and you assess how economically and socially dependent a human community is on their fisheries, that boosts us way to the top, because 3/4 of New Bedford's fishing revenue comes from scallops at this point. So even a modest decline in those populations as a result of climate change could mean major economic issues. Of course, to put all of this into perspective, if we think we have it bad here in New England, try looking at a place like Kiribati. This is a string of, I think it's 32 little coral-based islands in the middle of the Pacific. Their maximum elevation is somewhere between 6 and 7 feet above sea level rise. So based on current estimates, if we continue with current greenhouse gas emissions scenarios, they're looking at having no land by the end of this century. And in fact, an analysis by scientists at the University of Hawaii about a year ago, or maybe not quite that long ago, found that well before they're completely submerged, those islands will be completely uninhabitable, because as the sea level rises, it of course is displacing their fresh groundwater that they use for drinking. And it's also creating higher storm surges, and so any agricultural land is being overwashed and will be more frequently overwashed with salt water, making agriculture impossible. So they're looking at, by the middle of this century, just 20 to 30 years from now, all of those islands being uninhabitable. Their president has actually already bought some land in Fiji and is entering into agreements with New Zealand, and I believe in negotiations with Australia, to create immigration agreements. And international lawyers have actually already created a term that apparently has not filtered into diplomatic circles yet to really consider this, but they've actually created the concept of a whole new class of nations, nations ex situ, nations that no longer have any geographical nation, but which could continue to exist as disembodied legal entities, so that they could still have a voice at the UN, even though they might not have any place that they could live. Now, island nations like this were very much a presence at the UN climate talks in Paris this past December. I was lucky enough to be able to be there for the second week of the talks. And those nations, those island nations, had actually coined a phrase, 1.5 to survive, which you could hear in various protests around the conference grounds, basically saying that the UN framework for about 10 or so years has been that the goal would be to try to limit global warming to an average of 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial temperatures. And what they're saying is all of the science that we have seen in the past decade or so has said that 2 degrees of warming is too dangerous, that we need to keep that to 1.5 degrees C or less in order for these island nations to survive. And it certainly wasn't just the island nations. This was a protest I ran across one day in the middle of the conference area. Some young people from Brazil saying that basically you would have to be a cactus to survive climate change, because one of the major impacts that they're seeing is drought and desertification. There were other protesters there who were trying to hook onto anything cool and popular. 100% clean, choose you must, a little bit of Jedi mind tricks to try to get people to buy into renewable energy. Women from around the world, but particularly the global south, were another very strong voice at the talks. because women around the world are disproportionately impacted by climate change, in part because of their childcare and care of elders and the health impacts that come with climate change, and also because they are disproportionately responsible for providing food and water, and agriculture and water, of course, are being majorly impacted. And then, of course, kind of inseparable from women's issues, young people were very much a presence at the talk. And at the talks, this was one particular protest where, I don't know if you can see it, but they're holding these big black square brackets and saying, "Don't bracket our future," and they've got tape over their mouths. What they're referring to is the fact that as they are drafting these agreements, things that are still in negotiation, phrases or wording that are still in negotiation, are put in square brackets. And so one really rough way to gauge the progress of the talks is just to look at how many square brackets, how long the document is, and how many square brackets there are, how much of it is still up for grabs. And I arrived on December 6th. The document was about 50 pages, 49 pages I think at that point, and had almost 100 square brackets in that. There was a lot still left to do when we went into the high-level negotiations of that second week, and there was a lot of concern that there was too much to do to get through in that week. But by Wednesday and then Thursday, we'd seen the document cut almost in half and the number of square brackets cut in half, and a real ripple, I mean audible ripple, went through the 3,000-person newsroom when that draft of the document was released, because in it was something that nobody expected to see. And in it was the possibility of setting the goal for this agreement at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Nobody really thought that those island nations and their voice were going to make it into the negotiation text, but by Saturday, which negotiations are technically supposed to end on Friday, they released the draft text at noon on Saturday, and they didn't finally approve it until about 6 p.m. Paris time on Saturday. But, going the wrong way. But you don't need to read all this, but this is the goals statement of the final Paris Agreement, and what's in yellow up there, what had actually come out on that Wednesday was 3 possibilities. One goal could be limiting to 2 degrees C, as has been the stated goal for years. One, on the opposite end, would be to limit it to 1.5, and then one, the middle road, and I think this is very indicative of what happened in Paris overall. The middle road was, we will limit warming to 2 degrees C, ideally closer to 1.5 degrees C. A middle road acknowledging that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is going to be very difficult. In fact, at the conference, when this first draft with that in it came out, a number of scientists held a panel and they said, honestly, we've never considered what it would take to hit 1.5. We've never modeled the economics and the energy systems that we would need to limit it to anything less than 2 degrees C. But we'll be starting that this weekend. So they started that back in December trying to figure it out, and I would say that in general the assessment is that technologically it is probably just barely possible and will probably require going into a period of what's called negative emissions. Basically there's going to be we're going to have to use some technology that will actually be pulling carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere, because it's going to be almost impossible, shy of going cold turkey, which is not terribly feasible, to actually stop greenhouse gas levels soon enough to not overshoot that 1.5 degrees and come back. To give you a quick rundown of what was agreed on in Paris, and this is blatantly plagiarized from Phil Duffy, who is the current president director of the Woods Hole Research Center. He had a wonderful Paris by the numbers slide that I basically pulled from him. I mean, one of the amazing things about this agreement is 195 countries. How you get 195 countries to agree to anything, I don't know, especially when you have countries like Kiribati who face an existential threat from climate change, and on the other hand, countries like the United Arab Emirates who face an existential threat from stopping our use of fossil fuels. To get them on the same page on anything, to me, is quite amazing. 188 of those countries have already committed to emissions reductions, and one thing that was really interesting about this agreement, and I think part of the reason that we actually were able to get an agreement this time around, is that it didn't start with a top-down, you will reduce your emissions by this much. It started from the ground up more than a year ago with the UN saying, you need to submit to us your plan, and your commitment for what you are willing and able to do in terms of reducing your greenhouse gas emissions footprint, and especially for developing nations, you need to tell us what you can do on your own and what you would like to do if you had help, and how much help you would need from the international community in order to be able to do that. So most of the world is now covered by voluntary commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions through 2030. One of the legally binding aspects of this treaty is the fact that every 5 years, countries will come back, report their progress, and be required to set a new, more ambitious target for their actions. So it's ramping up over time. It's actually 2 years that they have to report back, but every 5 years with that report, they have to ramp up their ambition. And then it sets this goal of somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees C as the maximum warming that we will allow. That, of course, requires a lot of back calculation. You can't actually make a target like that legally binding, because from that you have to back calculate how much carbon dioxide can we have in the atmosphere, and methane and other gases, to lead to that temperature rise. And there's uncertainty in the science of how much greenhouse gases leads to how much warming. So this is an aspirational goal. It's not a legally binding goal. Now, John Holdren, the president's top science advisor, has really helped draft the American commitments, which I'll show you in just a moment. But I think his assessment of what this agreement does is really important, because there have been a lot of people who have said, well, this is nowhere close to enough. And his response is, of course it's not. It was never meant to be enough. This is a critical first step, but on its own, it is nowhere close to enough. That's why the ramping up part of it is so important. So what the US is committed to, at least initially, is somewhere between a 26 and a 28% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions, and that's below 2005 levels. So one of the really confusing things about all of these different voluntary commitments is that everybody uses a different baseline. We're going to drop our emissions by 25% compared to last year, or compared to 1990, or compared to, so they're all different. It's very hard to put all these different commitments on the same page, but this is what the US is committed to, and of course they'll have to go back and ramp this up. They've also committed, in terms of aid for developing nations, $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund, which is an international fund to give grants to developing nations. And then while we were at the talks, John Kerry announced an additional $800 million in grant funding to developing nations for adaptation efforts to help them meet the challenges of the inevitable changes, even if we do reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one thing that is interesting is that, in fact, Massachusetts adopted these kinds of measures several years ago. So Massachusetts, back in 2008, basically took the UN recommendations and turned them into law with the Global Warming Solutions Act, and said by 2050, by 2020, we will drop greenhouse gas emissions by 25% below 1990 levels. That's what the UN said would be needed to cap warming at 2 degrees C. And by 2050, we will actually have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. Now, given that not everyone did this, we now have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which means any cuts need to be even steeper. And given that the end goal has now shifted closer to that 1.5 degrees instead of 2 degrees, this is definitely not enough. In fact, what the scientists at the conference were saying is basically the entire world needs to be greenhouse gas neutral. That doesn't mean we can't emit any greenhouse gases, but any greenhouse gases we emit, we have to be making up for somehow, and we have to be at that point by 2050, universally. Now, Massachusetts, even on this scale, has been having trouble. We probably will not hit our 2020 goals. Most assessments say we will likely hit 2030 and could hit 2050 goals, but the 2020, the goal is unlikely at this point. However, we have made significant reductions, and I would say one interesting thing that's happening right now in Massachusetts is that economists have been saying for years that agreement, no agreement, regulations, no regulations, all of that could be put aside if we would just put a price on carbon. The whole process would basically take care of itself. Massachusetts actually has 2 bills pending right now that would put a price on carbon throughout the economy. The folks that are pushing those bills tell me that this year is really more about education. They don't really expect that to come up for debate and vote until next session. But that is something that's starting to happen in Massachusetts. And one word of caution with regard to what is going on here in Massachusetts is that I think we have to be really careful as we put these various policies into place to address one problem that we don't create another problem. And that's a problem of environmental injustice. Daniel Faber at Northeastern University has done 2 different surveys of environmental injustice in Massachusetts and finds that we have some of the greatest disparities in the entire nation. And he actually points the finger at some of our greenest policies. Because he said, what happens when you start to regulate emissions, when you say you can no longer go dump your trash in the ocean, or you have to actually hold your toxic waste in one place. Inevitably, all of those toxic waste sites, those power plants, all of the landfills, the objectionable things that people don't really want in your backyard, those tend to end up in the poorest and most disadvantaged communities. And in Massachusetts, communities of color, poorer communities of color bear on average about 4 times the environmental burden of more affluent and predominantly white communities. And in some cases, the disparities are far more than 4-fold. The numbers on toxic waste disposal sites are pretty dramatic. An average of 2, I think it's per square mile, in affluent communities, an average of 48 in some of the communities at risk. And these communities are all over Massachusetts, not just in the greater Boston area. There are a number down here in southeastern Massachusetts where you see these yellow and orange hotspots showing communities at risk. So I think that's something we really need to be very cognizant of, and has actually come up in the presidential campaign recently with the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. There was actually a push to have that Democratic debate in Flint last week be focused entirely on environmental justice. That, of course, did not come to be, but it is at least becoming a topic. And with that note of caution, I would like to end on a positive note. If you watch the State of the Union, you may have heard President Obama slam climate change deniers. In the sense that it was a slam on climate change deniers, it was a fun moment. But I think what he did was actually a truly teachable moment. So here's what he had to say. Can you hear that at all?
No.
No. It's not. The volume's really low. All right, well, I guess we won't hear it straight from President Obama's lips. Basically, he said when the Russians beat us into space, we didn't deny that Sputnik was up there. We recognized the challenge, and within a handful of years, we put a man on the moon. And so, in the sense that it was, as I said, a slam on climate change deniers, it was also a really teachable moment, and I think a really optimistic moment, harkening back to his presidential campaign, that yes, we can. This is a huge challenge, but we have met huge challenges before, and this is one that we can meet. And I think that's a really important message, because psychologists have shown repeatedly that if you give people a really dire message, the human brain is programmed to shut those out if there's nothing we can do about it. There's no reason to be depressed and overwhelmed for our entire lives if there's really nothing we can do about it. But the message that there is something that we can do about it, that we're starting to do it, and that it simply needs more effort and more optimism is really powerful, because that in and of itself can help people who have problems accepting the science of climate change come to grips with that science simply by knowing that it is something that we can tackle. So with that, I will end my comments. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. And again, thank you so much for having me here today.
Questions? Betsy?
It's a great message, and people are hearing it everywhere about the Antarctica, the Greenland, but how do we localize it? For Westport, Dartmouth, New Bedford, that's what's going to make the message sink in, is how's this affecting your river? New Bedford will economically affect it, but what about Westport and Dartmouth? They're beautiful towns. Economically, they probably won't feel it quite as New Bedford will. Do you have any suggestions on how we localize this message? We have salt marsh degradation, but we're not sure why. We have nothing to hang on to.
I think, I can't necessarily tell you exactly what the message is for each community. Certainly the economic impact of fisheries for New Bedford is very powerful. I think sea level rise is another one that many coastal communities can relate to very clearly. And there you have a little bit of a challenge in all of these cases, the challenge of distinguishing what is natural variability and what we absolutely know is climate change driven. But sea level rise is one of those that it's pretty unequivocal, that the rate of sea level rise that we're seeing at this point is unprecedented within the last, since the glaciers melted 15,000 years ago, and that that has implications. In addition, are all storms, they're not caused by climate change. Extreme storms are not caused by climate change. We've always had major storms. But the comparison that I've heard a lot of times, there are a number of different analogies or metaphors you can use that get it across. But if you like baseball, it's like having a batter on steroids. That probably that batter was already really good. If you take a Babe Ruth could already hit home runs, absolutely. But you put Babe Ruth on steroids, and the chance of home runs and the frequency of home runs goes way up. And that's basically what we've done to our climate and weather system. So the chances of those really big storms go up. And then if you put the big storms together with the sea level rise, what you get is a lot more damage. And so I think, one thing certainly on the Cape that's gotten a lot of attention, hasn't necessarily totally refocused the conversation on climate change, is FEMA flood maps and insurance rates. Right? When you look at insurance rates going up in coastal communities around Massachusetts, that's a sure way to get people's attention. And then within a group like this, if you're concerned about what's happening to your river, I think just that simple statistic that as the temperature goes up, the damage that any nitrogen pollution does gets that much more dramatic, which means that we can't immediately stop the temperature rise. It just makes efforts to limit nitrogen pollution that much more urgent. Right? The levels that we need, the targets that we need to reach for nitrogen pollution have essentially dropped because the temperature is rising in a way that we can't control on a local level. So we have to control what we can locally.
David?
I believe that Paul Schmidt is one of the co-sponsors of one of the bills for carbon emissions fee in the state legislature. If he's here and will confirm that. He is here. He had to go. Well, anyway, I convey to his good wife our appreciation for the fact that he is standing for that, and I think it's one of the very important pieces of legislation that we need to enact in Massachusetts so that we can take the lead in the East Coast and across the country.
One unabashed plug for WCAI, we're actually going to be doing a 5-part series on the price of carbon later this year. Looking at not only the Massachusetts legislation, but I'm hoping to go out to British Columbia. They've had a law on the books very similar in structure for 7 or 8 years, and see what their experience has been. Look at some of the new science. There was actually just a recent report from the National Academies on kind of the science behind how you determine what the price of carbon should be. So we're going to take a look at a lot of that stuff, I think, early fall probably.
Good. Other questions? One per family.
Different.
I get it sometimes.
What about the United States military? I understand that there are task force working on this because they see climate change as a security threat. Could you talk a little bit about that, and why don't we hear a lot more about that?
Yeah, so I don't have all of the specifics at my fingertips, but certainly, the military has been working on this for years. It's considered a threat from a number of different standpoints. The first is the assessment that in fact fossil fuels are the root of many soldiers' deaths. Whether that's because a fuel convoy is a really nice target to blow up, or simply because of the cost of the fuels. And so they've been working on, a lot more soldiers carrying backpacks coated in solar panels, and there are initiatives at a higher level. They currently have fighter jets that can fly on, I believe it's a 50% biofuel mix, and I think it's both the Air Force and the Navy, I think, have commitments to like 50% biofuel by a certain date. I can't remember what the date is. Trying to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels, and then also from the impacts side of things. If you go down to Newport Roads, right, Norfolk, and the huge naval base there, they have a huge adaptation project that they're undertaking because they've realized that with sea level rise, they can't just keep their infrastructure the way it is. They have to have this Navy base, and so they're going to have adjustable, floating docks instead of fixed docks, that they're making changes to infrastructure, recognizing the impacts of sea level rise and increasingly intense storms. So yes, the military has recognized this, and not just under President Obama. This is something that the military was working on at the same time that President Bush was saying that we didn't need to do anything about climate change. And so why we don't hear more about it, I don't know. I think it's a really powerful story to counteract some of the political divides on climate change. But yeah, it is a fascinating story, and there's definitely a lot going on in terms of technological innovation. It's actually interesting. I was at a workshop a few weeks ago that the main focus of the workshop was putting robotics into use for aquaculture. But someone from ARPA-E, which is like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, but specifically for energy technologies, and he stood up and said, just so you know, we've just decided we have a pot of money that we would like to put into research on large-scale aquaculture for biofuel production. So if any of you are interested in getting into that, submit your proposal to ARPA-E to basically grow algae and kelp for biofuels as opposed to just corn for biofuels. So there's certainly a lot going on in the military sphere.
One more.
Massachusetts is going to have to replace the fossil fuel and nuclear energy from Pilgrim, and there are two kind of big proposals out there. One is deep offshore wind, and the other is importing hydropower from Quebec, from Canada. And I was just wondering if there's a kind of environmental scorecard from greenhouse gas or even other just, impact to resources as to, which is preferable or how they compare.
I wish. No, there is nothing so simple as a scorecard where somebody's gone and tallied it up. This is actually one place where, especially with the environmental justice issues, the other thing which you didn't mention is the push for new pipelines and more imported natural gas to Massachusetts. At this point, I think it's 62% of our energy comes from natural gas. And actually, ISO New England, the energy regulatory organization, actually a couple of years ago, cited our over-reliance on natural gas as a serious reliability issue, simply having too many eggs in one basket, especially given concerns about pipeline limitations and supply limitations. You take Pilgrim offline in southeastern Massachusetts in particular, we're looking at the potential of energy shortages as soon as 2017, if they do go offline that soon. I think their official is 2019, but what I've been told is they would have to refuel in 2017, and if they can make the case to ISO New England that they can replace that energy, they wouldn't want to refuel. So we could see Pilgrim go offline as early as 2017. Which, puts us in a real conundrum. And I'm not sure there's an environmental scorecard. All of these things come with upsides and downsides. I would say personally on the hydropower issue as well as the natural gas issue, I think the issue that we face in terms of an environmental justice issue is that we catalog our greenhouse gas emissions as simply what is created here in Massachusetts when the fuel is burned or when the energy is used. And so they look like zero impact or very low impact fuels and sources of energy. We don't take into account methane leakage or impacts of fracking or impacts of damming in Quebec in any way in our actual cataloging here in the state of Massachusetts. And I think that sets us up for some, for environmental justice issues where we're really, putting blinders on and saying, well, as long as what happens in the state of Massachusetts stays in Massachusetts kind of thing, and that's what we worry about. We're putting blinders on to the full impact of our energy usage.
Thank you very much.